What happens when the enforcer becomes the criminal? Helen Bradshaw's hand trembled over the flame. Would she burn everything to stay in control? James Holloway leaned against his front door, exhaling slowly. The scent of gasoline still clung to the night air. His car, gleaming under the porch light, was streaked with fuel, a silent warning of how far Helen Bradshaw was willing to go. But she had made a mistake. This time, James had proof that he glanced at his phone, the video still playing on the screen. Helen, her sharp features illuminated by the glow of her lighter, had hesitated for only a moment before realizing she was caught. And then she had run. James hadn't chased her. He didn't need to. Instead, he had made a call to someone who didn't bother with petty local politics. Someone who handled people like Helen with cold efficiency. Now, as the first streaks of sunrise touched Willow Ridge, James sipped his coffee and watched from his window. The neighborhood was waking up, but they had no idea what was coming. Two black SUVs rolled silently onto the street, their tinted windows reflecting the golden morning light. James set his mug down. Right on time. Three men in dark suits stepped out, their movements practiced, precise. These weren't local cops. These were federal agents. James could almost hear the sharp intake of breath from his neighbors as doors cracked open, coffee cups paused mid-sip, and phones were raised to record. The spell of Helen Bradshaw's control was about to shatter. The lead agent approached her door and knocked, firm and measured. Silence. Then another knock, louder. James smirked. He could picture Helen on the other side, debating whether to answer, calculating, spinning her usual web of excuses. But this wasn't a fine she could issue or a neighbor she could intimidate. Then the agent spoke, his voice carrying down the street. "Mrs. Bradshaw, we have a warrant." "Open the door." A hush fell over Willow Ridge. A long pause. Then the slow creak of a doorknob turning. James stepped outside, stopping just beyond his porch. The entire neighborhood seemed frozen, watching as Helen finally appeared. She was still perfectly put together, her tailored slacks crisp, her blouse meticulously ironed. But her face was different. No smug smile, no air of control, just fear. The lead agent held up a document. "Helen Bradshaw, you are under arrest for attempted arson and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent." James barely heard the rest. He didn't need to. He was watching Helen, watching her process the moment her world collapsed. Shock flashed across her features, then quickly shifted to rage. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "I am the head of the HOA. Do you know who I am?" The agent didn't blink. "Ma'am, turn around." Helen's gaze darted across the street, searching for an ally, someone to defend her. Her eyes landed on James. "You did this," she hissed. James didn't move, didn't blink till Helen's breath came faster, her carefully controlled composure cracking. This was a game she had always won, but not this time. "This is harassment," she spat, her voice laced with desperation. "You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." She turned to the crowd, expecting agreement. Silence that a few people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. No one spoke up, because deep down they knew. They had watched Helen bully her way through this neighborhood for years, watched her hand out fines for mailbox designs, turn neighbors against each other, and threaten legal action over porch decorations. She had ruled by fear, and now fear wasn't on her side anymore. Diane, agent stepped forward, securing cuffs around her wrists. The sharp click echoed through the street. Helen's face went white, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. James stepped closer, his voice even. "You thought you were untouchable." He tilted his head. "Now you know better." The agent led her toward the SUV. Helen struggled, but it didn't matter, because this time she wasn't in control. The car door shut. The neighborhood watched as the vehicle pulled away, disappearing down the street. The reign of Helen Bradshaw was over. James remained in his driveway long after the SUV was gone. The weight of what had just happened settled in slowly. For weeks, Helen had acted like she was invincible. She had controlled this neighborhood with an iron grip, forced people into submission, and believed she could bully him into leaving. Now she was gone. And Willow Ridge. It felt different already to be why the next morning. The news had spread far beyond the neighborhood that a local reporter stood on Helen's lawn, a camera crew behind her. Helen Bradshaw, the longtime president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, was taken into custody early this morning on charges of attempted arson and criminal trespass. she announced. Residents say tensions had been rising between Bradshaw and one of the newest homeowners, but few expected the situation to escalate into criminal activity. James sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee as he watched as a neighbor, Greg Lawson, appeared on the screen next, shifting uncomfortably. She always liked control, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I think some of us knew she was a little extreme, but setting someone's car on fire? That's insane. James let out a slow breath. Extreme didn't even begin to cover it. But not everyone was on board with reality just yet that a second neighbor, Linda Wilkins, stood outside her house, arms crossed. This whole thing is ridiculous, she huffed. Helen worked hard for this community. She made sure it looked nice. Now we're just letting some outsider ruin it. James let out a dry chuckle. There it was. Even after everything, there were still people who would defend her. People who didn't care what she had done, as long as she maintained their illusion of control that he wasn't surprised. But he also didn't care. That afternoon, a new email landed in his inbox. Subject: HOA leadership change. James opened it, skimming the first few lines. And he smiled. James Holloway leaned against his doorway, arms crossed, watching as Helen Bradshaw's lips curled into a thin smile. You're the one harassing me, she said smoothly. James let out a dry chuckle. By trying to tow my car? By putting illegal signs on my property? By sending me fake violations? Helen's smile didn't falter. You don't belong here, she said softly. James' jaw tightened. I own my house. That's the only requirement. Helen took a step forward, her voice lowering. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. James didn't move. Go home, Helen. For the first time, her expression cracked. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked back toward her house. James watched her go, tension coiling in his gut. This wasn't over. He had prosecuted people like her before, ones who thought they were untouchable. But Helen Bradshaw? She was something else entirely. The next few days proved it. First, a city inspector showed up, citing an anonymous complaint about unpermitted renovations. James hadn't changed a thing. The following morning, a sanitation officer knocked, claiming someone reported excessive trash. His bins were empty. It was relentless. Then one night it escalated. James had just finished reviewing case files when he heard it, a faint rustling outside. His instincts kicked in. Years of dealing with criminals had trained his ears for deception. He switched off his office lamp and moved toward the window that a figure stood in his driveway, Helen Bradshaw. His stomach tensed. She wasn't holding a clipboard or a violation notice. She was holding a red gas can. His pulse spiked. She moved quickly, pouring fuel along the hood of his car, then down the driver's side. Her movements were mechanical, practiced. She wasn't hesitating. James grabbed his phone, hit record, and just as Helen pulled out a lighter, he yanked the front door open. Drop it. Helen froze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Him in the doorway, her in the driveway, lighter hovering inches from an arson charge. A flicker of panic crossed her face, but it vanished, replaced by something worse. Righteousness. You don't belong here, she said. James stepped forward, voice low. And you just made sure you don't either. Helen clicked the lighter open. A small flame flickered to life. James' stomach clenched. A single spark could catch the gasoline vapor, crawl toward the house. But Helen had no idea who she was dealing with. He lifted his phone. You're on camera. Every second of this. Helen's eyes darted to the screen. For the first time, she looked unsure. Then she ran. The gas can dropped. The lighter clattered onto the pavement. She bolted toward her house. James followed. But by the time he reached the sidewalk, her front door had slammed shut. His pulse pounded as he turned back toward his car, the sharp scent of gasoline filling the air. The lighter's tiny flame flickered weakly before dying out. James crouched down, snapped a few pictures, then dialed number. Not 911, that he had someone better to call. BY morning. Willow Ridge was awake. Two black SUVs pulled up in front of Helen Bradshaw's house. Not local cops. Federal agents. James stood at his window, watching as 3 men in suits stepped out. Their movements were precise, practiced. Helen must have seen them, too, because she didn't come to the door right away. One of the agents knocked. Then again, harder. James could imagine the scene. Helen standing behind the door, debating whether to open it, wondering if she could spin this into another misunderstanding. Then the agent spoke, loud enough for half the street to hear. Mrs. Bradshaw, we have a warrant. Open the door. Silence. Then, the slow creak of a doorknob turning. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering. Some clutched their coffee cups. Others held up their phones, recording. Helen finally stepped outside. She still wore her usual press blouse and neatly tailored slacks, but her face told a different story. No smugness. No carefully controlled expressions. Just fear. The lead agent held up a document. Helen Bradshaw, you are under arrest for attempted arson and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent. The rest blurred. James didn't need to hear it that Helen's face shifted fast. Shock, then anger. This is ridiculous, she snapped. I am the head of the HOA. Do you know who I am? The agent didn't blink. Ma'am, turn around. Helen's gaze whipped toward James. You did this. James didn't move. Didn't blink. Helen shook her head, breath coming faster. She still didn't get it. She still thought this was a game she could win. This is harassment, she spat. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it. She turned toward the crowd. You're all okay with this? With outsiders ruining our neighborhood. Silence. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. Because they knew. They had watched Helen bully people for years, forcing fines, turning neighbors against each other, threatening legal action over mailboxes and porch lights. She had ruled by fear. And now fear wasn't on her side anymore. One of the agents stepped forward, securing cuffs around her wrists. The click echoed through the street that Helen's face went white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. James stepped closer, voice even. You thought you were untouchable. He tilted his head. Now you know better. The agent led her toward the SUV. Helen struggled, but it didn't matter, because this time she wasn't in control. The car door shut. The neighborhood watched as the vehicle pulled away. The reign of Helen Bradshaw was over. James stood in his driveway long after the SUV disappeared down the street. For weeks, she had acted untouchable. She controlled Willow Ridge with an iron grip, made people bend to her rules, and believed she could bully him into submission. Now she was gone, and Willow Ridge already felt different. Effective immediately, Helen Bradshaw has been removed as president of the Willow Ridge HOA. An interim board will oversee association matters until a formal election can be held. James Holloway exhaled slowly. It was over. He closed his laptop and glanced out the window. The neighborhood looked the same, trimmed hedges, identical houses, driveways lined with cars. But something had shifted. The air felt lighter. The weight that had settled on his chest since moving in was finally gone. No more fake violations. No more threats. No more war point 2 days later. James stepped outside to find a small box on his porch. No return address. No note that he crouched down, picked it up, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, neatly folded, was a Willow Ridge HOA membership form. A small yellow sticky note was attached. Membership not required, but welcome. Neighbor James stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly, a grin spread across his face. He picked up the form, ripped it cleanly in half, and tossed it into the trash, because now Willow Ridge belonged to him too. Helen Bradshaw had thought rules and intimidation made her powerful. But in the end, she learned the hard way. Control is an illusion. It doesn't matter how many fines, threats, or petty power plays you throw at people. The truth always wins. And when you cross the line, the law will always be waiting.